And this kind of brings me to the second part of what it is I wanted to talk about, which is what I believe is ultimately the purpose of concept art. First and foremost, certainly it is to just design the world, right? Like the concept art is basically conjure up these images of what it is the player is going to see in the game. But that at the same time, like I believe those efforts should not just be limited to graphical themes. They should also pertain to like gameplay elements, like what if we could fly rather than like walk or something like that. This is typically something that the concept team should and could and should help out with, because it is so much easier for them to give people a rough understanding of what that would look and feel like. And this sort of leads up to the last point. As ironic as it sounds, the task of the concept art certainly is also to fail, simply to prevent others from having to do that, right? Like one guy making a painting in 5 days that we decide not to move forward with is far cheaper than like a whole production team doing the same thing in the space of 2 weeks, basically. So we definitely don't sort of mind working on stuff that doesn't necessarily end up in the game. And this is what I mean by art as a device. Like it is ultimately, and this doesn't just specifically apply to concept art. It also applies to sort of game art in general. Like the goal of the art is to sort of further strengthen the overall experience. It's never a goal unto itself. The highest goal of like any game development team, I believe, is always to make a game that's fun, right? Like, and to this extent, the art is a means to an end. An interesting story we sort of hear quite frequently within the studios is a testing session for Halo 1, where they were in the last stretch of development, and they were testing the game on a daily basis, and even though there wasn't any new content, they would still get new groups in to just test all of the content. And so what would happen is that as levels were being worked on and they were being prepared for test, they were already tested when sort of the light maps, which is basically the information that is needed to provide a space with actual lighting, when the light maps weren't ready, the multiplayer maps were already played, and then what you found was on one day, when the maps would be played without the lighting maps, and you would compare that to the next day when the lighting maps were ready and people would play them with the lighting maps, you would find that sort of across the board, all features of the game were rated much higher in the version where there was the light map, right? Like this basically means that everything has the capacity to make everything else better. So if you have good lighting, people will animate or sort of appreciate the animation better or think the sound is better. And so that comes back to the art as a device, right? Like you, as a concept artist, it's ultimately tempting to think, well, you know, this is what it's all about, and the art direction should, you know, like always win. But the sort of what I believe is actually the case is that it always needs to be this marriage of all the individual components of the whole production pipeline to make like a single statement at the very end. For concept artists specifically, it's very tempting to get caught up in like the specifics of what kind of tool it is you use in order to create your art, right? Like, is it Photoshop, or is it 3D, or is it like a program like ZBrush? None of that ultimately matters. Like in our team, we have guys that literally do not know what a polygon is, right? At the same time, we also have guys that work in 3D exclusively. The point really is that as a concept artist, the only thing that ultimately matters is your idea. What is at the very end of your own sort of production cycle? That is what matters. Another thing to focus on as a concept artist is to make sure that whatever it is you're working on, it can be described in a single sentence. And this is something that we struggle with a lot. Like, how do you actually create a compelling narrative in just a single sentence? And you know, sometimes we succeed in that, and sometimes we don't. This is one of our earlier sort of inspirational pieces done at the very start of the project by Jamie Jones. And this is a good example of such a thing, I believe. Something that can be described in a single sentence. It would be something like, you know, a crazy robot soldier slumped against an otherwise classical-looking wall. There's an interesting juxtaposition right in there, and that is ultimately all it needs. But it's a very simple scene, but it has enough, you know, interest in it to sort of hold its own ground. This is another good example of that. It's a very early Moons painting by Dorje Belbrook. And, you know, like I would describe this as something like, you know, triangular structure floating with a, like, unearthly, heavenly body in the background. Doesn't need to be anything more than that, but it can be described in a single sentence, and that's ultimately really important. So concept art absolutely contains a portion which is just like subjective art direction, right? Like, what is it what is it that sort of the art direction defines as, well, this is appropriate and this is not. This is a very subjective thing, and often comes with, it is often the result of sort of the personal preference of the art director. But on the other end, there's definitely also a very objective portion to a successful image, and this is something that we very frequently refer to as objective image quality. The slides I'm going to show you next are sort of a very small section of a much larger talk that I give on occasion to some of the guys in our team, and it basically serves as an example that you know, art should be minimalistic. It should be efficient in communicating what ultimately matters and what doesn't. So what you're seeing here is a very early production painting by Rolf McQuarrie for Star Wars. It's sort of a production sketch for the Death Star. It doesn't really look like the Death Star in the film specifically, but if you look at sort of what the individual components are, there's a bunch of guns in there, there's a bunch of guys, ships flying in and out, you see a bunch of stars in the background, although it's hard to see. There's clearly a very large structure in front of you. That ultimately is all that matters, right? Like, it's a very elegant piece in the sense that it doesn't throw in a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff in order to get that message across. And so this amounts to a good amount of clarity, right? And this is another great example. This is the production facility of Lamborghini in Italy. This image in itself leaves no doubt as to what the focal point of this scene is, right? And as such, it has a very clear hierarchy of information. Everything that happens up top clearly is not important, right? Like, and as you go down, there's a bunch of sort of detail on the ground, but ultimately the thing that everybody's eyes is going to gravitate towards is the red car, and as such is a very, very functional image. This is a World Press photo that won in the wildlife category, and has that same very readable hierarchy, right? Like, if you think about what the scene is, it's undoubtedly a very chaotic scene. All these animals sort of, you know, moving in front of the camera. But at the same time, despite all of that chaos, if you were to ask anyone to sort of point out just an animal, they would all point at the same one, right? It's just so gracefully isolated from all the other ones compositionally, and this is great. Like, this is the spirit of that is what needs to sort of permeate like a video game as a whole, right? And if you're talking about an action game like Destiny, it is critically important that that hierarchy is in place at all times, so that, like, for example, when I do play a multiplayer map, I do understand, like, what is a tree and what is a crate and what is a guy, because otherwise it breaks the game, and people will still say it might be pretty, but they'll think it's boring and they think it's not fun. It's because of that lack of hierarchy. Another different thing that I talk about a lot with my concept artist is something that I like to refer to as inherent scale. If you think about designing things that do not exist in real life, it's very important to realize that the size of something, to an extent, is going to dictate what it looks like. And what that means is that if you have something that is about this size, it'll have features in it that are very similar actually in scale to the thing as a whole. Whereas if you look at something that is really big, the tiniest details will no longer compare scale-wise to sort of the object as a whole. This is a phenomenon that occurs in nature as well. If you think about, for example, like the eyes of an insect, the eyes of a wasp, right? Like in the picture on the left, they would amount to about 10% of the size of the animal itself. But then if you think about that with an elephant, for example, an elephant's eyes proportionally is much smaller. And when you're talking about designing fictional things like spaceships and stuff like that, it is really important to be aware of things like this. And the same is true for man-made stuff as well. In fact, very frequently, even more so, because of the fact that ultimately everything is designed towards the human scale, right? So you'll get spaceships or like ships with windows in them that simply are a certain size because of the way that like humans aren't scaling up with the object in question. A great example of this again is Star Wars, where they have a very clear where this process is very clearly implemented. Like, despite the fact that all of these are sort of scaled down to fit in the same size box, these designs themselves kind of give away how big they are, and obviously sort of culminates with the Death Star, which is incredibly big and is the simplest shape you can imagine. So those are some features that we talk about when we design our stuff, and this is something that I can go on and on about.